Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, What Cities Do Best, Subnational Integration and Ideal Roles for Cities in Climate Action. And today it's my pleasure to welcome Pete Erickson. Unfortunately, Derek Brokoff is under the weather, but they are both quite renowned scientists, senior scientists here from the Stockholm Environment Institute. And they are going to share, Pete's going to share their most recent working paper that explores vertically integrated approaches to city-related greenhouse gas emissions and multi-level governance and policy actions, especially in China, Brazil, and the US. I am Scott Muller, and on behalf of the Working Group on Subnational Integration of the LEDS GP, I would like to thank you all for joining us today for this interactive webinar. To begin, I'd like to first invite you to please explore the webinar interface if you are listening via your computer. It has several features. One is a link to document downloads that are relevant to Derek and Pete's presentation today. There's also a nifty chat feature to interact privately with other colleagues on the call. But most importantly, there is a questions tab. Now, if you don't already know here, Pete and Derek really are doing some of the most leading edge research in the field of low emission urban development. And this is a unique chance to ask them the big direct questions. So please go ahead and type your questions directly into the pane there on the windows. And please don't wait until the end of the presentation, as they tend to get bottlenecked. So rather, if you could enter your questions as soon as they pop into your mind during the presentation. And yes, you're free to ask as many questions as you wish. Okay. One more note, and that will be that there will be a brief survey at the conclusion of today's presentation. Great. Now, in the past 2+ years, the Subnational Integration Working Group has grown to well over 100 members, and that includes national and subnational governments, international organizations, NGOs, and individuals. In this time, the group has realized many activities, including organizing panels at multiple regional and global forums, hosting peer learning discussions, publishing reports and case studies, along with facilitating technical workshops, these webinars, and championing thematic recognition in multilateral fora, as well as a feature that provides remote expert assistance on LEDs upon request. There's more resources that you can download here at the website, ledsgp.org. And most importantly, if you haven't yet, please go to the site and follow the instructions to register yourself as a member, as a participant, as a participating member of the group. And this is really the best way to keep abreast of future meetings and other opportunities to participate in the global partnership. And this includes fellowships and other working groups. I wanted to just share a quick snapshot of one of the projects the working group is currently executing. And these are regional assessments at the country level on the coordination and vertical integration of climate actions. This is focusing on the Latin American and Caribbean platform, as well as the Africa LEDS platform. And among the outputs this project will produce, include documenting innovative and cutting-edge subnational LEDs and integrated measures across those platforms. And this is going to identify model programs and good practices in multi-level governance of climate actions. So if you're interested in collaborating with this research, or perhaps featuring some of the projects you are producing, please go ahead and contact me directly with any questions. And then it says, is there a screen being shared? Pete, can you see my screen?
No.
Really? Okay. How's that? Final slide. That's okay. We will pass it to you, Pete. So it's my honor here with that to go ahead and change the presenter to Pete Erickson to begin.
Great, thank you. I'm just loading my screen up here, and I'm going to show my video just to make it, hopefully make it a little more personal here. Feel free to turn that off on your end, everybody, if you, especially if your bandwidth limited. Well, welcome and hello. My name is Peter Erickson. I am with the Stockholm Environment Institute, and I send my regrets, unfortunately, for my colleague Derek Brokoff, who did much of this research. He is home ill today. But nonetheless, we wanted to share, as Scott said, some of the work we've been doing over the past couple of years on the greenhouse gas abatement potential of cities, and more broadly, what some quote-unquote best, we should have put best in quotes, best roles for cities in climate action. So I'm going to talk through a couple studies that we have done here at SEI over the last couple of years, both of them funded by Bloomberg Philanthropies. And feel free to type clarifying questions into the chat box as we go. I'm going to try to limit my presentation to 30 minutes or so. We'll see how we do, but so we have plenty of time for discussion, and I've teed some up at the end. So, Scott, can you see the slides?
Yes, looks good.
All right, good. Just wanted to make sure. So first, just to set the stage a bit, I'm going to show this chart about global GHG emissions pathways. And I'm sure you've all seen charts much like this. Here we have business, quote, business as usual emissions pathways. And these are largely from the IEA, although we've added in the non-CO2 gases that the IEA doesn't cover. So a business as usual pathway, a reference scenario that incorporates the recent national policies that countries have put in place. And you see that that really does take us on a different pathway than the pure business as usual. Nonetheless, the emissions gap, as it's often been called, including by UNEP and others, is substantial. A 2-degree pathway would take us on, well, emissions trajectory declining starting now and going much deeper than the pathways we're currently on. So one of the first questions we were asking is, well, what if all urban areas in the world went as aggressively as they could towards low carbon development and energy efficiency and other kinds of actions that cities can do, how much of the gap would that make up? In other words, under a very ambitious and assertive program of actions, how close could cities get us to a 2-degree pathway? And so that's this orange jaws, this orange wedge, if you will, in the chart, is the sort of top level finding from a study we did about a year ago. And so it's, in 2030, it comes out to be between 3 and 4 billion tons, 3 to 4 gigatons of CO2 equivalent, up to 8 gigatons in 2050. So using this just to set the stage, because now in the rest of the presentation, I'm going to talk about what makes up, what comprises this orange wedge, and what might be a quote, vertically integrated approach, where there's different levels of government working together to attain this potential in urban areas. So to sort of outline the rest of the talk, then first I'm going to pose a framing question about different ways of looking at urban action on GHG emissions. Then I'm going to go into the numbers of what we found, essentially, what different actions and different measures make up the potential, and then talk about the research that really Derek led, with some help from me and some help from my colleague Carrie Lee here, on a vertical integrated approach, how to maximize the role for cities. So first, I wanted to just talk about these two different ways of looking at urban action that, and we've seen both of them in the common, dialogue. You've probably in this group stumbled and talked about these two. And one is that cities are often looked to as leaders, as innovators. We call this sort of the lighthouse model of cities, right? It's the idea that cities can experiment with things on the ground perhaps more quickly than national governments, and in that way test out things and show the way for broader action. There's another framing where it's not so much cities leading the way, although these things are by no means mutually exclusive, but it's that cities are essential partners. Because they're on the ground, they can really implement and administrate policies related to building efficiency or whatever that are perhaps set at higher levels of government. And so something to keep in mind as we talk through these findings is these two different framings, and which might be, well, more applicable, I suppose, or just let's keep it in mind, because they're both important, they can complement each other, and they could both benefit from national support. But I think there are some implications for scale of action that will become more important as we get into some of these findings. So our focus is in this series of analyses we've done is on maximizing the ambition of global greenhouse gas abatement, right? We need to get to 2 degrees. We need an efficient and effective way to get there. And so in that regard, we look at what the maximum, or, you never want to say something's the maximum because it assumes it couldn't be any better, right? But what is really a very technically ambitious pathway for cities and low carbon trajectories. And then what is the, quote, best way to achieve that? So what really is the role of cities in an efficient global pathway to a 2 or a 1.5 degree world? And what actions at different levels of government are needed to get there? Okay, so brings us to the second sort of section of the presentation. I called it the numbers at the beginning. It's where is the urban abatement potential in sectors and in different regions. And so this is, you can think of this as zooming in on that original orange wedge in that first chart. This is breaking out just the urban abatement potential that we found. And this is global. And it's important to say that we defined urban as the UN World Urbanization Prospects does. So they define it essentially as individual countries do as they report to that UN program. So it's not just cities per se, it's really metropolitan areas and towns and anything that national governments consider to be urban. So, and I should also say that we looked at the measures that we looked at were related to things that urban areas and city governments do as part of their normal business and where they have some unique or special policy influence. So buildings, because cities often work on building energy codes or permitting for construction. We looked at passenger transport because cities and local governments control urban form and land use and public transport, as well as in some cases licensed vehicles, and even in some cities, local governments, like I know, in Singapore, there's different registration fees for different GHG or CO2 intensity of the vehicles. Freight travel, because there are some local freight of delivery of goods in cities, of course, and then waste management. Notable, that's not in this list is industry. And that's because industry is responding to much, more regional, more national demand. Industries are not in general driven by the demand of the city that they're located within. Furthermore, cities don't have as many policy levers over these industries, and industries, well, in most cases would be better addressed by national policy, with some notable exceptions, of course. But there's also what's happened with cities and industry in, for example, Rio de Janeiro, where there's a large steel mill that has emissions, much bigger than the normal, than the buildings and transport operations of the city. And so, if the city were to focus on the steel mill, it might encourage it to just move across the border in order for it not to be on its ledger, and that wouldn't lead to any global reductions in emissions. So, for those reasons, we do not consider industry in this analysis to be a source of urban greenhouse gas abatement, even though it is a source of urban emissions per se, I suppose. Okay, so that long aside, thank you. Here's what we found in terms of the potential of different actions. So we found that buildings is, perhaps most significant, really, overall. A little bit more in residential buildings and then commercial. And these are actions like building energy retrofits, where not just for appliances, but especially for heating energy in colder climates. So that is especially in North America and in Europe, where there is large and extensive building stock to colder climates and relatively inefficient buildings that could benefit from deep retrofits. We assumed retrofits to almost passive house levels in these areas, and we assumed that new buildings would be built to passive design standards in all areas. So that's very ambitious, but it relies on the work of others as well. I should say that we relied on many others' work here to come up with these estimates. We didn't generate many of the individual assumptions on our own. Most of them relied on others. So for buildings, we used the work of the Global Buildings Performance Network and some of the findings that they had globally. Happy to share the paper that we cite here cites that paper as well if you're interested in it. In passenger transport, we used the work of ITDP and Lou Fulton of UC Davis. They created what they call a high shift scenario. They used the same model as IEA does, but they worked as hard as they could to maximize mode shift in public transport. So you see here that reductions in emissions in passenger transport are also significant, and we'll get into some of the details of exactly what comprises these different shares. First, though, I want to just show where in the world we found the abatement potential to be concentrated. And I should just caveat this by saying we didn't publish this regional chart because we didn't go in and do individual studies in each area. Rather, we used a global model that had some regional detail, but so don't tweet this slide per se. But you can see here that lots of the potential is in Asia, especially East Asia, especially China, especially South Asia, especially India, and then quite a bit in Europe, the blue and gray countries here, well, in Europe and North America, Latin America and Caribbean as well, but quite a bit in North America and Europe. That's because there are these affluent lifestyles, these colder climates, these inefficient buildings, and high personal transport, especially in North America. Okay, so unpacking the buildings abatement just a bit more, as I said, quite a bit of retrofits here. Those are especially important in earlier years, but the later out you go in time, as more and more new buildings are built, the more that building energy codes for new buildings come to dominate. So that's important in the near term to be putting in place very efficient buildings so you don't lock in higher emissions pathways in the long term. Appliance and lighting efficiency is very significant as well. Lower GHG fuels, that's mainly shifts in select areas from like heating oil to natural gas or electric heat pumps. And then we found a pretty small potential globally for solar PV. We were using a couple studies that were a few years old, and they roughly agreed. However, I think that the changes in the solar industry in the last few years would suggest that this could probably be bigger than we noted here. In passenger transport, significant contributions from the three legs of the stool: the avoid, the shift, and the improve, as it's often called. So urban planning, making compact communities that have more trips by bike and pedestrians and fewer by vehicles. People are closer to the services that they need. That reduces off the top quite a bit of demand. Then there's mode shift to public transport. And then there's car efficiency and electrification of the vehicles. And for the car efficiency, we took our assumptions there from the International Energy Agency. So big roles for urban areas. So this is quite an interesting chart. It's a little bit complicated to explain, but let me just say the most important point here first, and then go into some of the details. So we talked about, how there's this big role for urban areas, right? It's between 3 and 4 gigatons in 2030, 8 gigatons in 2050 of abatement potential. Cities can contribute to closing that emissions gap, as we said. But that potential is very diffuse. Along the x-axis here, the cumulative number of urban areas. So that abatement potential is spread out over 5,000 plus urban areas, and each urban area itself is a constellation of individual cities and towns. So each of those areas, you can see that there's, for about 5,000 of those urban areas, there's less than 1 million tons of abatement potential in 2030. That's the y-axis, is abatement potential in 2030. So that is a challenge that I think needs to be grappled with when we're thinking about the role of cities in global climate change mitigation. Now, on the flip side, there's this cluster of cities over on the left, these megacities, these what the UN calls megacities in waiting, and other large cities, urban areas of 1 million or more people, where there's anywhere from 2 to 20 million tons of abatement potential in each urban area. So, what is I think this is a good, question for discussion later on, but what is a good model in order to capture this? Is it something like C40, where you have the megacities and the megacities in waiting over on the left, demonstrating the practices and hoping that these smaller cities, these growing cities, will take them up? That seems like a good model, but probably insufficient. So let's talk about that a little more. And to kick off that kind of thinking, let's move into the third major area of this presentation, which is what is the most appropriate role for city governments in realizing this abatement potential that we've sketched out. So here's the same chart again, at least the numbers are the same, the urban abatement potential. But in this case, instead of denoting it by sector or by region, we really looked measure by measure and assigned each measure, like building, heating, energy efficiency, to a particular role of that city government. Does it make sense? And does the literature suggest, and does common experience with city government suggest that they are in the best place to be the policy leader and the architect of that policy? I mean, does it make sense for them to write the rules, essentially? For things like urban planning and urban form, that's something that cities have to do anyway, are already doing. They could do it in a much better way, say. So yes, that's where cities could be policy leaders and architects. Or are they critical implementers, where they may not be setting the policy? I'm thinking, maybe building energy efficiency, for example, or definitely appliances, right? Standards are often set at the national level, but they can be implemented by, and often are implemented by cities and local governments. So that's this second part of the chart, the critical implementers. That's where cities have that role. And then there's areas where cities have an important role to play, but they may not either be setting the policy or really doing the main, implementing. They're strategic partners. I'm thinking here things like, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, for example. So let's talk through each of these three roles in a bit more. And first, just some sort of general principles about whether city or more regional or more national involvement is most appropriate. And this is based on a literature review that Derek undertook, Derek Broekhoff here, who again is sick today. So city government involvement in climate policy is really most appropriate where success depends on things that cities are already well acquainted with and are already doing. Existing local government capacities, where local data and information is important, where you have to mobilize people or other resources on the ground, where local stakeholders need to be communicated with on a very regular basis and brought in to be part of the solution. And then where there's targeted mitigation measures that are contained within city boundaries with low leakage risk. Leakage being, of course, the idea that if you reduce emissions in one place, they are compensated with increases in emissions elsewhere, such that there may be little or no climate benefit. On the other hand, national or state involvement in climate policy is more appropriate where success depends on economies of scale, right? Where there's a risk of free riders. You need to bring everybody along and not just let the leaders lead the way. Where you need a lot of coordination across multiple levels of government, multiple jurisdictions. It makes sense for national governments to take a leading role there. Where leakage is a concern within country, like the industry example, you wouldn't want the cement or the steel plant to just move across the city boundaries, right? You need to take a comprehensive look at that. And then, as I said, avoiding free riding. So, considering all this, we found that the quote best role for cities, and we put in quotes because we're painting with such a broad brush here, right? This is not going to be the case in every jurisdiction or necessarily even in every country, but we saw a gap in the literature to really articulate at least this sort of ideal, quote ideal scenario, realizing that it may not always be the perfect case. Nonetheless, quote best role for cities, for them to be policy architects and leaders, urban spatial planning and public transport are places where it's very clear role for cities to take it up and be the leaders. Where does it make perhaps most sense for them to be critical implementers? That would be in building codes, building energy codes for heating, for appliances. And then where strategic partners? Well, when there's energy and there's information outreach about energy efficiency, where there's not a building code per se, but you need to communicate to people that the new LED bulbs are available, for example. Makes sense for cities to be strategic partners in electric vehicle infrastructure and deployment, and also in distributed energy resource. In other words, rooftop PV, for example. the zoning and permitting for that is a good place for cities to be involved. By contrast, national and state government roles may make more sense for them to lead on efficiency standards, on the policies for distributed energy. In other words, what are the right incentives to have rooftop PV have bigger penetration? Implementation, such like vehicle and appliance efficiency standards, to coordinate multi-jurisdictional transportation planning, for example. So, where there are not regional governments set up, well, there's a role for regional governments or national governments to coordinate between local jurisdictions to make sure that transport systems are set up adequately, for example. And then to enable local capacities and enhance their authorities when needed, where there are barriers to city action because they don't have the legal authority to play out these important roles. So the key enabling actions for national governments are to provide or improve access to local government financing, right? Many of these measures, city governments need money to do, public transport especially. Strengthening local government capacities and governance structures. So, enforcing building codes takes people power, takes technical authority in order to be able to do that. And local and national governments have a role to play in helping to provide funding for it even. And to align policies and remedy conflicts. So, as I said, give local governments the authority to put in place policies like congestion charges, where they may not have the authority to now, but policies that would help affect the transport infrastructure. So back to cities and their roles. This is the policy leader and architect role. Overall, that's about 20% of the urban mitigation potential that we found, and most of that, although not all of it, is in passenger mode shift and then in land use planning. So helping cities to be more compact and transit friendly. And really the biggest need for enabling action from national governments in that is financial support. Also some needs for capacity in terms of technical skills and planning frameworks. But the biggest need is finance. For cities as critical implementers, that's about 40% we found. Again, these are rough numbers. It's not going to be the same in every area, but approximately 40% of urban mitigation potential. And for new building, heating efficiency and heating retrofits are really the biggest levers here. And here there's need both for financial support and especially for capacity, because as I said, this takes a lot of people power to make happen. And despite there being, as we've seen for decades now, lots of, financial reasons to do some of this, it doesn't happen on its own. You need programs and people to make this happen. And then cities as strategic partners is the remaining 40%. Appliances and lighting is a significant part of that. Again, a need for capacity there, but really these are more policies that are probably best set at the national level in terms of car standards, appliance standards, truck standards, and then frameworks for solar PV to be integrated into grids. Okay, so moving towards sort of some key findings and questions for discussion here. So that's key message number one. Under an aggressive global program of action, we saw in the first chart, and then we elaborated, the cities could make up about 15% of what's called the emissions gap between pathway we're currently on and what we need to do to be on a 2-degree pathway. So cities have a big role to play. Actually didn't talk much about this second one, but it's sort of the flip side of abatement. It's if cities don't go on this low carbon pathway now, they could be locking in future emissions that are harder to undo later and make it more costly for the world, for national governments to realize their climate goals. So, you've probably heard this number being thrown out about, 1,000 gigatons is the remaining carbon budget we have, and it's declining rapidly. But, this century, in order to stay on a 2-degree pathway, cities are on a year-to-year basis. Cities are locking in about a third of what gets locked in globally. So it's cities, the infrastructure they build, the transport systems, the buildings, those decisions are very hard to undo later. And third, really, there's this need for vertical integration, for engagement and coordinated action from national governments to enable them and to help set the stage for cities to really realize this abatement potential more quickly and fully and cost effectively, certainly, than they would be able to on their own. So, we've taken this first step, really. We just see it as that, to build on what's been done before, but to try to see how these pieces, these different levels of government could interact in this idealized scenario to achieve the 2-degree target and to achieve cities' role in that. So, where in that, what is the right role for the lighthouses of cities? I mean, we have, it's a fairly common refrain, as the New York deputy mayor said, and Michael Bloomberg, former New York mayor, has said something like this very often. City are the center of innovation. Climate change will be solved at the city level. Okay, parts of it will be, and that is an important role for cities. There's also this workhorse vision, which is perhaps more related to what I've laid out in our research today, which that abatement potential is widely dispersed. There are pressing financing capacity needs for cities to take on this workhorse vision, that there's a need for national coordination, and that cities should, if we're going to take on a global, ambitious scenario to try to get to 2 degrees, we need to be thoughtful and efficient about that, and that cities then should perhaps focus on what they, quote, do best. The kinds of activities where they're already engaged on the ground, and actions that need a big dose of local responsiveness, that need to be implemented on the ground, and that need partnering between multiple levels of government. Another topic that might be interesting, I would love to hear your thoughts and talk about is, so what is the right strategic balance between these two visions? We need both, and how, as practitioners in this field, do we engage with both the lighthouse vision and the workhorse vision? How do we not have there be a tension between those? And then, the big question, I suppose, is how do we work towards more vertically integrated policies to achieve deep GHG reductions? So that's the end of my presentation. I really look forward to discussion. We can go back to any of these slides. This is my contact information. This is Derek's contact information. Derek led much of the work on the vertical integration, and he is sorry he couldn't be here today. This link is to our most recent report. I think Scott also put that on here as a handout. So thank you so much, and I look forward to conversation.
Hey, thanks.
At least.
Thanks, Pete. That was great. The questions are starting to roll in here. There's space for more if anyone wants to drop them in. Pete, I'm going to put up a couple of the slides real quick that I skipped in the beginning while we discuss some of the questions here. And they're quite interesting and maybe not fair to you as Derek's not here, throwing it in the hot seat. But how did you arrive at the typology for best roles of city governments? You selected 3 there. What was the process how did you come to that grouping?
That's a great question. And I mean, we did a lot of literature review in kind of, city planning literature, urban planning literature, to see the different kinds of roles that cities play. So that's one place. And then also, we just kind of wanted, sorry, there's some emergency vehicles outside. We wanted roles that really covered the full landscape of how cities could engage, and those seemed to cover it. But be interested whether people on the call thought we missed some, or what. So those are the three roles, and then yeah, I mean, in terms of how we decide, how we kind of bend the different levers into the three roles. Again, we looked at literature in terms of sort of traditional city planning, but we also looked at work like what C40 has undertaken with their climate action in megacities, where city governments have filled out surveys about where they have authority, where they have power to do different actions, and then draw on our own experience working with cities on low carbon action plans.
Okay. Why China, Brazil, and the U.S.?
Good question. I didn't really speak about particular countries. So yeah, we have a case study in our report. We have some brief case studies on, oh, it's asking me to share the screen again. Anyway, on China, Brazil, the US, and also South Africa. We wanted just some countries that had different types of governance structures in different parts of the world, and that also were significantly urban, and were significant emitters. So those are four that we looked at just to get a sense of whether we were on the right path here. We worked with local partners in each of those countries. So in Brazil, we worked with Susanna Khan at the University of Rio. In South Africa, we worked with Sustainable Energy Africa there. In Cape Town, in China, we worked with Tsinghua University, and LBL, who's in the US, but works especially in China. Actually, we did a study on a focus on Canada as well. And then we are in the US, so we looked at the US policies, although we consulted with many others, such as the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance.
So one of the questions is, in that line is, they would like to know on which information basis you estimated the abatement potential. As you said that you've not gone into detailed country analysis, so what was the information basis?
Great question, and I should have talked through the methodology in more detail, so thanks for giving the opportunity to do that. We created the scenarios. We started from IEA, International Energy Agency, scenario data, especially their Energy Technology Perspectives series. So IEA does, on a regional basis, create these reference and low carbon scenarios. So we worked with IEA, with other people who have also interpreted IEA's results, like ITDP for transport, and like Central European University and Global Buildings Performance Network on the building side, to essentially downscale IEA results to urban areas. IEA's transport model actually already segregates urban and non-urban areas, so that was relatively straightforward. On the building side, we had to make assumptions about, in each different region, what fraction of residential and commercial buildings were either urban or not urban. And we vetted those assumptions with analysts at GBPN. We did not have the time to go, to analysts specifically in each region, like in China, and say, do our assumptions here make sense? Rather, we trusted that IEA had already done their homework, and that GBPN, for example, in the building sector, had already done their homework. So then on the abatement measures that then we applied to that reference scenario, again, we tried to use region-specific abatement options from IEA and many other sources whenever we could. So there is a good amount of country and region-specific detail in our analysis. It's just that we don't want to go out, because we haven't done a full, deep, complete study for any individual country, we don't want to go out and say, these are the results for country X, for example. We did get some feedback that in India, I have been presenting these slides in a number of venues with some of the country level results. Got some feedback on 2 different occasions from folks in India that cooling demands in India for air conditioning are growing much more rapidly than had been anticipated. So that might be an area where we have underestimated.
This is an interesting question. I'm pooling a few of them here, but and it has to do with one of the working papers that we've published in the working group, looking at the co-benefits of vertical integration, not just for climate action, but some of the co-benefits that come from that. And when you look at the other multilateral environmental agreements under discussion this year, the post-2015 Sustainable Development Goals and the disaster risk reduction programs of work, multi-level governance has been, very much an integral part of those, a fundamental role in achieving those objectives of those programs. Why do you think that multi-level governance has been slower to take shape in climate action?
Huh. Oh, that's interesting. I'd be curious on the questioner's take on that as well. I guess it seems to me that there's been such a need to get the big international and national direction set through, the COP process, that and that is essential. That is necessary, right? Climate is a collective action problem more than some of the other issues are. It can only be solved with a strongly international approach. And so maybe because that has been so slow to develop, that there's been less attention on vertical integration, sort of on these sort of roll up your sleeves details of how to implement that. I don't know. Does that resonate with you or with others?
We'll wait for feedback, but that discussion comes up every now and then, and some people have put forward that energy is more of a commodity than some of the other development activities. So in that line, I think it was AR5 that talked about it's great progress that so many city climate action plans are being put forward, but they're really focusing on energy efficiency. And in this research, have you seen any collaborative activities, Pete, between national and subnational that look at land use and expansion of cities? This is one of the challenges in Africa and Latin America is that the cities are growing 2 and 3 times faster than their population. They're physically expanding so fast. Is there any collaborative activities you've seen around land use and zoning?
Well, that's a good question. That is exactly what we're trying to dive deeper into in our research this year. So we're just sketching out more along that. I'm sure there are others that are better, more expert on that topic than we are. But we did identify, some potentially good examples, or started with a good example in Brazil. Susanna there at UFRJ found that there's this, national urban mobility, national urban planning policy and framework in Brazil that, in principle, could guide the local jurisdictions, but that it needs more to it. And if there's anyone on the call that knows more about that, that'd be interesting to hear. But I think it's an area where it's a pretty big gap. There aren't many strong, national urban development strategies. And, it's interesting, we saw last week here in the US, Obama proposed a funding source, a $10 a barrel fee on oil production, and one of the things that would fund is a national approach to urban development in the US, as well as to innovation in electric vehicles and many of the things here that that we consider to be urban. So it's interesting that those needs are recognized, but I don't know, it'd be great to hear folks in the question box put in other examples of that.
What role, Pete, do you see for cities in really promoting behavior change among residents?
That's a great question, and one that I think if we had looked at something else, that was sort of next in line to look at here, because I think, there's been in the last, decade maybe, there's been sort of a growing but still marginal conversation around consumption, and what low carbon consumption would even be. But if any level of government was well positioned to start that conversation and start that action, it would seem to be cities, because of their close touch with their residents, and because cities can enable some of the things that might be considered low carbon consumption, like sharing of resources, with neighbors. If you have, or better exchange of just used goods in general. Instead of everybody having a drill or a lawnmower or whatever it is, there's one for the whole neighborhood. So that's one area. And then in energy efficiency, of course, there's big opportunities for behavior as well. And it seems like, just because of the proximity of people to each other in cities, maybe those kind of conversations about how to change behavior can happen better in cities. And there aren't that many really good examples of where it's been done. There's been some efforts in in the UK that have been interesting. In the US, there's low carbon consumption in Oregon, but then again, it's these developed countries where behavior is the biggest issue right now, right? There's pretty big inequity in terms of consumption patterns, and so maybe it needs to start in places like the U.S. and the UK.
Yeah, I think that brings up a natural transition here to looking at urban ecosystem services, and that cities that are really taking more, I think, of a bundled approach in monitoring and valorizing their urban ecosystem services, and many of those sort of outside the city, in their watersheds and their seascapes, their pollution abatement. So in your literature review, did you identify any city capacities in that management of urban ecosystem services and their links to mitigation and adaptation?
That's interesting. It seems like there really are links between ecosystem services and adaptation, for sure. I'm thinking things like stormwater management, what's called green infrastructure in some cases. On the mitigation side, the links aren't as obvious, I would say. I don't know. I'm curious what you think as well, but maybe green roofs have some cooling effects, say, as well as some stormwater effect. I don't know if that's commonly considered an ecosystem service or not, but seems like to fit. We didn't look at those in particular, but those could be considered part of what makes a energy efficient building. Then again, the denser and more compact the community is, the less of a ratio there is between roof area and people per square foot.
Yeah, I think, at least in my research, in my activities, the topic is coming up more and more about urban forestry and the links
Yeah.
between urban heat island impacts and energy use in buildings can be quite significant. And with different mapping technologies now and different wavelengths in unmanned aerial vehicles, you can see very clearly the impact of urban tree canopies on energy use in the city. And then, of course, you can overlay that as well with demographics and looking at the price of real estate and temperature impacts and things like that. So it becomes very interesting very quickly. And that opens up to, you talked in the beginning about short-lived climate pollutants. And they wanted to hear a little bit more about how addressing short-lived climate pollutants in transportation and waste might facilitate mitigation.
Certainly, and with the call for 1.5 degrees coming out of the Paris COP, the role of short-lived pollutants may be even more important. It's probably only possible to get to 1.5, or it's even more important to look at those short-lived pollutants. I think in many cases there's synergies. Addressing the short-lived pollutants also addresses climate. I'm thinking particularly building efficiency. I'm thinking vehicle efficiency, and perhaps industry. If it's addressed through efficiency or fuel switching. Not if it's addressed by moving the industry out of town. Sure, that helps the local air pollution benefits, but it doesn't necessarily help the climate. So I think there's a lot of synergies to explore, and the urban area is a great venue to do that. There are some places where actions, recent actions on air pollution may not actually have a climate benefit. Just a few though. I'm thinking of natural gas buses, or other diesel vehicles. There's been some research that converting over your fleet and essentially locking in a fossil based high GWP fueling source is actually worse than sticking with the diesel, or at least it's not much better, even though it is better from a local air pollution standpoint. But it seems like there's lots of opportunities, and I know there are many initiatives underway, including by my SCI colleagues, to sort of better integrate short-lived foresters into climate planning, including at the local level. Is that a topic you've been addressing in this group?
I think it's coming up more and more, especially in the developing country approaches. When you're looking at urban leadership and mayors, their investment decisions have to resonate on a 5-year timescale. So when you can focus on things like asthma or just air pollution, sometimes those initiatives are a higher priority than tons of CO2.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that that rings true not just for local air pollution, but for any of the things that might be called co-benefits. Really, it's really the other way around. Local leaders are doing what they're doing not for climate reasons, and it's climate that's the co-benefit. So it's important to keep that in mind, and perhaps start policy discussions with what local jurisdictions want to do for those other reasons, and then seeing what the climate implications of those are. So that seems like something that's been underexplored from a research angle anyway. including the work that I just presented. Is about, well, what's the urban abatement potential, and that's an important question to ask, but it's not always as relevant for the local decision maker themselves.
Right, and there's more emerging research also with adaptation and short-lived climate pollutants driving sudden deluge events and the uptick in precipitation. So coming out of China, coming out of Peru, they're getting these links between high particulate pollution and these deluge events that are, once in 500-year rain events. And what's interesting is you can look at the rain gauge data, and it's only falling right on top of the city. And we're understanding more about convection cycles and the role of particulates in kicking off, especially in coastal areas, this new phenomenon of these ungodly deluge events that are beginning to happen. So I think there's an adaptation link there as well. Another question here is, what modeling tools have you seen, Pete, that help cities make informed decisions on major infrastructure investments? Ones that look at the greenhouse gas footprint for both construction and use of that infrastructure over, say, the lifespan of the infrastructure?
That's a great question, and there are more of them. GHG footprint for both the construction and the use. So I'm thinking of particular buildings, say. I mean, I know that the building industry has a number of tools. Unfortunately, I can't list any of them. I'm not familiar enough with them. So maybe others on the call can put some in the chat box. I mean, I'm more familiar with the sort of more aggregate level planning tools. The World Bank and C40 have a new one called Curve. ICLEI has had a series of them, including a really nice new one called ClearPath. Some planners have used SCI's LEAP tool, but these tend to be more aggregate level tools than for individual infrastructure decisions. And the ones I have seen for individual infrastructure, they do include both the emissions associated with construction of a thing as well as its lifetime energy use. That can be quite interesting. One thing that's hard to capture in that is any displaced vehicle travel, right? There's the benefit of putting that building in the middle of the city versus on the periphery, and sometimes that could be as big a benefit as any, and yet it's hard to capture analytically. So I think there's still more to be done in this tool development space, but if folks have ideas, let's see them in the chat box too.
Pete, recently we did a webinar with Oscar Weinberg and colleagues that looked a little bit about the rise of transnational environmental organizations and cities, climate actions, and the emergence of many different initiatives working in the subnational space to achieve. And if you look at the NASCA site and the rise of those, very impressive climate actions, to what extent do you observe that these subnational and city climate actions can be quantified and included specifically in countries' NDCs? It's quite uneven. Part of Oscar's point was that this seemed to be part of a northern hemisphere phenomenon. That a lot of the cities working in this space were overwhelmingly from OECD, and that it's uneven at best. So if you could speak a little bit to how you envision the best way that cities can be included in the achievement of these NDCs.
Well, I haven't seen many INDCs, reflect explicitly urban action. Partly it's that urban action isn't quantified and isn't generally well quantified when it is. I mean, there's a lot of pressure to put out big numbers, right? And I'm thinking especially when cities make, sort of political goals about how much they're going to reduce emissions, right? So when those are quantified, it's hard to know, what the basis of that is in many cases, and it's not something that a national government could simply port into its INDC. So, it also raises the question of how national governments see themselves working with local jurisdictions along the idea of this vertical integration. It seems to me that those modes of working together, as you pointed out earlier, Scott, are not really that well developed because national governments have been more focused on on the international space and on the bigger sort of framework policies that they could put in place. So it seems like a really important area and reason, for there to be working groups like this.
Well, Pete, thanks for such a great presentation. And wrapping up, before we get to the poll here, wrapping up with the last question, which is, generally people are very excited about your contribution specifically for building this foundation on the potential of urban greenhouse gas abatement around the world. What are you working on next? What's the next steps in this research?
Oh, thanks. That's a nice question. Well, we're scoping that out and always interested in working with other partners. The thing that we're really hoping to focus on this year is on this question of urban development, and particularly with a vertical integration perspective. So as you saw, we found that this urban form question, this public transport question, compact cities, is really the area where cities have a very unique and powerful and important role to play, and there's also a role for nations to enable that. So we'd really like to dig into that in more detail. And then I think there's a really great need just for more studies on vertical integration, more studies like this. I mean, not to, this may or may not be a good template to apply, but just in particular country context, looking through what the authorities are at different levels of government and thinking about how they could, taking a sort of comparative advantage approach like we have here. What's the comparative advantage of different levels of government and how could they work together to achieve really ambitious climate goals? I think that's really exciting. It's not something, it's a topic that there's room for all kinds of institutions and actors to get involved in studying. So it's exciting, and I hope that some small way in this presentation I've contributed to convincing you all that that's an interesting topic. Well, you already are convinced, so it'd be great to be in contact with anyone here who's interested in that more.
Great, Pete. Well, we appreciate your continued assistance with the working group on subnational integration and look forward to future collaborations and publishing reports with you. The webinar here has been recorded. It will be available at ledsgp.org. I'd like to thank everyone for joining today's webinar. I seem not to be able to publish the poll here, Anna. But anyways, oh, here we go. Okay, if you could please pop in your answers to the questions here on the quick poll, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you. The webinar's presenters were effective. And we have one more question after this. We have no more questions after this. Okay, thank you everyone for joining. We look forward to future collaborations.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Scott.
Thanks, Pete.